I am Miller Files, and I have learned, through years of investigating crimes that never fully close, that the most dangerous murders do not announce themselves with chaos. They do not begin with screams, alarms, or broken glass. They begin quietly, so quietly that by the time the truth surfaces, the damage is already irreversible. On the morning of November 15, 2004, Delmar, New York woke up like it always did. Lawns trimmed, cars parked neatly in driveways, neighbors leaving for work without locking their doors. It was the kind of place where violence felt impossible, or at least unthinkable. That illusion ended inside a modest family home on Norfolk Drive. Inside that house, a man named Peter Porco was already dead. His body lay in bed. His skull had been split open by repeated blows from an axe. The wounds were precise, deliberate. There was no sign of struggle, no overturned furniture, no evidence of panic. Whoever did this did not rush. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. In another room of that same house, something even more disturbing was unfolding. Jean Porco, Peter's wife, had been struck in the head with the same weapon. Her skull fractured, her brain bleeding, injuries that should have rendered her unconscious or killed her outright. But Jean Porco did not collapse. She woke up, she showered. She got dressed, she collected the morning newspaper. She attempted to go about her day as if nothing had happened. Doctors later called it automatic behavior, a rare neurological response in which the brain continues familiar routines despite catastrophic trauma. To investigators, however, it meant something else entirely. It meant the attacker believed both victims were dead, and it meant the crime scene was lying. There was no forced entry, no broken locks, no shattered windows, nothing missing, no valuables taken, no signs of a burglary gone wrong. The murder weapon, an axe, came from the family's own garage. This was not a random act. This was intimate. This was intimate. This was personal. And from the very first hours of the investigation, one conclusion became unavoidable. The person responsible did not break into the Porco home. They belonged there. Peter Porco was a successful man by every outward measure, a respected executive, a devoted husband, a father who believed in discipline, honesty, and accountability. Friends described him as strict but fair, a man who valued truth perhaps more than comfort. That detail would matter later, because Peter Porco had begun to suspect something was wrong with his son. Christopher Porco was 21 years old, intelligent, well-spoken, a college student who presented himself as driven and accomplished. To outsiders, he looked like a young man on the verge of success. But behind the image, cracks were forming. Christopher was lying about his academic performance, lying about graduating, lying about having a job lined up. He was deeply in debt. He had used his parents' credit cards without permission, and he had gone to extraordinary lengths to maintain the illusion that everything was under control, including forging official documents, including fabricating letters, including deceiving the people who trusted him most. Peter Porco was closing in on the truth, and in the psychology of violent crime, moments like that are critical. Not moments of rage, but moments of exposure, when a carefully constructed identity is about to collapse, when consequences are no longer theoretical. The night before the murders, Christopher Porco was not supposed to be at his parents' home, but evidence would later suggest that he was. There were no eyewitnesses, no fingerprints soaked in blood, no confession. This case would never be about a single piece of damning evidence. It would be about patterns, timing, behavior. And a question that refuses to go away. What kind of person can walk into their childhood home, pick up an axe, and strike the people who gave them life, then leave and continue their day as if nothing happened. This documentary is not about gore. It is about silence. It is about lies that grow so large they require violence to sustain them. And it is about a mother who survived the impossible, only to face a truth she may never accept. By the end of this series, the courts will have rendered their verdict. But long before that, the evidence had already begun to speak, quietly, relentlessly. I am Miller Files. In every investigation, there is a moment when the crime scene stops speaking and time takes over. When walls no longer tell you anything, new and bloodstains have already said all they can say. That is when you turn to the clock, because time does not lie. It only waits for someone patient enough to listen. In the Porco case, that moment came quickly. There were no neighbors who heard screams, no emergency calls placed in the middle of the night, no sudden movements recorded by nearby security cameras. Whatever happened inside that house on Norfolk Drive occurred in a narrow window of darkness and silence. And that window mattered. Investigators began by establishing what they called the last normal night, Sunday evening. November 14, Jean and Peter Porco went to bed at their usual hour. There was no argument reported, no distress call, nothing to suggest that this night would end differently from any other. Christopher Porco, according to his own account, was hours away at his college dormitory. He said he had no reason to be home, no plans to visit, no emergency, no conflict that required a confrontation. But alibis are only stories until they are tested against time. The drive from Christopher's dorm to his parents' home took approximately 3 hours round trip. That fact alone did not incriminate him. Thousands of people make longer drives every day. What mattered was whether the timing allowed him to leave, commit the crime, and return without being noticed. Investigators turned to the one witness that never forgets: technology. Christopher's dorm room computer became a focal point. According to records, it was active at a specific time early that morning. Emails accessed, activity logged. On its surface, this supported his claim that he had been in his dorm all night. But when analysts examined the data more closely, a different picture began to form. The computer activity did not prove continuous presence. It proved a single interaction, a window of activity that could occur before leaving or after returning. In other words, the computer did not establish where Christopher was during the most critical hours of the night. Then there was the drive itself, traffic cameras, toll records, vehicle sightings. None placed Christopher directly at the Porco home. None placed him definitively elsewhere either. The timeline was empty, and emptiness in a murder investigation is never neutral. It is opportunity. The prosecution would later argue that Christopher left his dorm late at night, drove to Delmar, entered his parents' home using his own key, committed the attacks while they slept, and returned to his dorm before morning activity resumed. It was a theory built not on spectacle, but on plausibility. What investigators found more disturbing than the timeline was what they did not find. There were no defensive wounds on Peter Porco, no signs that he woke up before the first blow. That meant the attack began while he was fully asleep, a position of complete vulnerability. This was not an argument that escalated. This was not a moment of rage sparked by confrontation. This was a decision carried out while the victim was unconscious. Jean Porco's injuries told a slightly different story. She had been struck multiple times, but not with the same fatal precision. The blows were severe, but uneven. Enough to incapacitate, enough to kill, or so the attacker likely believed. In criminal psychology, that distinction matters. When a killer intends to eliminate witnesses hesitation is rare. Mistakes happen under pressure. But intent usually reveals itself in persistence. Here, the attack stopped. Why it stopped is one of the most haunting questions of the case. Did the attacker believe Jean was already dead? Did fear take over? Did something interrupt the plan? Or did emotion intervene in a way logic cannot fully explain? Investigators could not answer that with certainty. But they could say this: the attacker left without checking. That decision would define the entire case. Because Jean Porco lived, and because she lived, the timeline expanded. It forced investigators to reconstruct not just the night of the murder, but the morning after. Jean's behavior after the attack baffled even seasoned doctors. Despite massive trauma, she followed her normal routine. That suggested the attack happened hours before she woke up, long enough for the brain to enter an automatic state, which placed the assault firmly in the middle of the night. Back at the dorm, Christopher Porco was seen later that morning behaving normally, attending classes, interacting with others, making no mention of concern or fear, no frantic calls, no attempts to reach his parents. To some, that meant innocence. To others, it meant something far more troubling, because in cases where suspects are falsely accused, there is often confusion, anger, urgency. There is an instinctive drive to understand what went wrong. Christopher displayed none of that. Instead, he appeared detached. That detachment alone did not prove guilt, but in the context of the timeline, it raised questions that would not go away. Investigators began to ask themselves a dangerous question. Not could he have done it, but could anyone else? There was no evidence of an outsider entering the home. No unexplained footprints. No unknown DNA. No history of threats or disputes with anyone outside the family. Every path investigators followed led back to the same place. The family. The night that left no witnesses was not empty. It was crowded with implication, and as the timeline tightened, the walls began to close. Because time had done what it always does. It removed the impossible, and what remained was something far more disturbing. I am Miller Files. There is a moment in certain investigations when the focus shifts from what happened to why it happened. Not the surface why that suspects offer, not the convenient explanations, but the internal architecture of a decision. The quiet structure of lies that, over time, stop protecting a person and begin trapping them. That is where the Porco case truly begins to darken, because before there was an axe, before there was a silent house in Delmar, before there was blood on a bedroom floor, there was a story Christopher Porco could no longer control. By the fall of 2004, Christopher Porco was living inside an invented version of himself. To friends, to professors, and most importantly to his parents, he presented the image of a successful college student, someone who had completed his degree, someone who was on the verge of starting a career, someone who had turned potential into achievement. None of it was true. Christopher had failed classes. He had not graduated. He had no job waiting for him, and the pressure of those failures did not exist in isolation. It was compounded by money. Christopher was in debt, significant debt, credit cards opened in his parents' names, charges made without permission, payments missed, financial obligations stacking quietly in the background, while the illusion of success was maintained at the surface. For a time, the lies worked, but lies require maintenance. They require constant reinforcement. New fabrications layered over old ones, documents created, stories adjusted, explanations rehearsed, and eventually they require silence from the people who can expose them. Peter Porco was one of those people. Friends and colleagues described Peter as disciplined and exacting, a man who valued honesty and accountability above comfort. He believed that failure could be corrected, but deception could not be tolerated. To Peter, truth was not optional, and Peter was beginning to notice inconsistencies. Christopher's academic claims did not align with reality. His financial explanations did not hold up. The paperwork did not make sense. Questions were forming. Conversations were approaching. For someone like Christopher, that moment is psychologically critical, because exposure does not just threaten reputation. It threatens identity. When a person has invested years in pretending to be someone they are not, the collapse of that illusion feels catastrophic. It feels permanent. It feels like annihilation. And in criminal psychology, that is often the moment when rational limits begin to erode. Christopher did not simply lie verbally. He forged documents. He created fake letters from the university. He fabricated official correspondence designed to reassure his parents that everything was fine. This was not casual dishonesty. This was sustained deception. It required planning, attention to detail, confidence in manipulation, and it required time. Time he was running out of. Investigators later learned that Peter Porco was preparing to confront his son, that he intended to demand answers, that he planned to cut off financial support and force Christopher to face reality. To an outside observer, that may sound reasonable, necessary even. To someone living inside a collapsing lie, it can feel like a death sentence. What matters in this case is not whether Christopher feared punishment. It is whether he believed there was no path forward that did not end in humiliation and loss. Because when a person reaches that conclusion, morality becomes negotiable. The prosecution would argue that the motive was not hatred, but desperation, not rage, but panic, a belief that eliminating the source of exposure would restore control. And if that sounds irrational, it is worth remembering that many violent crimes are committed not by people who want to destroy others, but by people who want to preserve themselves. Peter Porco represented accountability. Jean Porco represented emotional safety. That distinction would matter. Jean was known as nurturing, supportive, protective. Even after the attack, she would defend her son without hesitation. There is little evidence that Christopher feared his mother in the same way he feared his father. In the internal logic of a desperate mind, removing one parent may have seemed sufficient. That does not make the act less monstrous. It makes it more chilling, because it suggests calculation. Investigators also examined Christopher's behavior in the weeks leading up to the murders. There were no explosive arguments, no dramatic confrontations, no visible breakdowns. Instead, there was calm, a dangerous calm. People often assume killers look distressed before they act, that they signal their intentions through volatility. In reality, some of the most controlled appearances hide the most violent conclusions. Christopher continued his routine. He attended classes. He socialized. He maintained the appearance of normalcy. And beneath that surface, the pressure was building. The lies were about to collapse. The money was about to run out. The truth was about to arrive at the dinner table. From an investigative standpoint, this is where motive stops being speculative and becomes structural. The question is no longer why someone would commit violence. The question becomes why they would believe violence was the only remaining option. That belief does not form overnight. It is constructed, lie by lie, fear by fear. And when the structure finally fails, the result is often sudden, brutal, and irreversible. The axe was not the beginning of this crime. It was the end of a long process, one that began with a single lie and ended with a family destroyed. And as the prosecution would later argue, the person who built that process knew exactly where it was leading. I am Miller Files. Every trial promises truth, but what it actually delivers is conflict. Not just between prosecution and defense, but between logic and loyalty, evidence and emotion, facts and the stories we need to survive them. The Porco trial was never just about an axe or a timeline. It was about a mother who lived and what her survival meant. By the time the case reached the courtroom, the investigation had already narrowed the universe of possibilities to one name. The prosecution did not arrive with a confession or a blood-stained weapon-bearing fingerprints. They arrived with something far more dangerous to a jury. A story that made sense. They told the jury that Christopher Porco had motive, opportunity, and means, that his lies were unraveling, that his financial deception was about to be exposed, that his father was preparing to cut him off and demand accountability, and that in a moment of controlled desperation, Christopher chose violence as preservation. The defense attacked that narrative relentlessly. They argued that the case was built on assumptions, on circumstantial evidence, on interpretations, rather than proof. They reminded the jury that no one saw Christopher commit the crime, that no DNA placed him at the scene, that timelines can mislead, that coincidence can masquerade as guilt. And then there was Jean Porco. She walked into the courtroom not as a witness, but as a force. Jean Porco did not hesitate. She did not equivocate. She did not ask for sympathy. She told the court calmly and consistently that her son was innocent, that she did not believe he would harm his parents, that the idea itself was impossible to her. To the jury, this was destabilizing, because the legal system is built on evidence, but human beings are built on narrative, and there is no narrative more powerful than a mother defending her child. Jean Porco had survived an attack that should have killed her. She had endured brain trauma, surgeries, rehabilitation. She had lost her husband, and still she stood between her son and the state. The defense framed her testimony as the ultimate reasonable doubt. How could a mother who knew her son better than anyone believe he was innocent if he were truly capable of such a crime? The prosecution saw it differently. They argued that Jean Porco's love was not evidence, that trauma affects memory, that denial is a powerful psychological response, that believing in her son's innocence was the only way she could continue living after the loss of her husband. They did not accuse her of lying. They accused her of surviving. Expert witnesses testified about automatic behavior, memory gaps, and the limits of recall after severe brain injury. They explained how Jean could honestly believe in her son's innocence while still being wrong. The courtroom listened as science collided with emotion. Then came the small details, the kind juries often remember: the forged letters, the credit card charges, the lies told without apparent remorse, the calm demeanor after the murders, the lack of urgency, the absence of panic. The prosecution asked the jury to look not at any single piece of evidence, but at the shape of the entire case. They asked a simple question: if not Christopher, then who? The defense had no answer. They suggested unknown intruders, unidentified enemies, random violence. But none of those theories matched the scene. None explained the lack of forced entry. None accounted for the use of a household weapon. None explained why Jean was left alive. The trial was not dramatic. There were no shocking confessions, no last-minute revelations, no cinematic twists. What there was instead was accumulation, day after day, fact after fact, behavior after behavior. The picture sharpened. When the jury retired to deliberate, they carried more than evidence with them. They carried a moral burden, because convicting Christopher Porco meant rejecting a mother's testimony. It meant choosing probability over devotion. After deliberation, the verdict came back, guilty. Christopher Porco was convicted of second-degree murder and attempted murder. He was sentenced to 50 years to life in prison. Jean Porco did not change her position. Even after sentencing, she continued to insist on her son's innocence. She wrote letters. She spoke publicly. She stood alone against the conclusion reached by the court. To many, that was tragic. To others, it was proof that love can outlive truth. From an investigative perspective, the verdict did not end the case. It crystallized it, because the Porco trial exposed a reality the justice system rarely confronts openly. That evidence can be overwhelming and still feel insufficient. That truth can be established legally while remaining emotionally unacceptable. That closure is not guaranteed, even when a case is solved. As I watched the trial unfold, one question stayed with me. If Jean Porco had died that night, would there have been any doubt at all? Her survival saved a life, but it also fractured certainty. And that fracture is where this case will live forever. I am Miller Files. There is a moment at the end of every long investigation when the evidence stops changing, the verdict is written into record, and the system declares the case finished. Files are archived. Transcripts are sealed. Sentences begin to run. And yet the story does not end, because criminal cases do not truly conclude in courtrooms. They conclude in the minds of those forced to live with the outcome. In the Porco case, that outcome left behind a silence more unsettling than the violence that created it. Christopher Porco was sent to prison to serve a sentence of 50 years to life. The legal system delivered its answer. The structure of the case was deemed complete. Motive, opportunity, behavior, and logic aligned strongly enough to meet the burden of proof. But certainty is not the same as peace. Years after the verdict, appeals would be filed. Arguments would be made about timelines, interpretations, and circumstantial weight. Each attempt sought not just legal relief, but narrative rescue, a chance to replace one story with another. None succeeded. Jean Porco continued to insist on her son's innocence. Her position never softened, never wavered. She visited him, she wrote on his behalf. She rejected the version of events accepted by the court. From a human perspective, her stance is understandable. To accept the verdict would mean accepting that the child she raised chose to destroy their family. It would mean that survival came at the cost of unbearable knowledge. For some people, that truth is not survivable, so denial becomes a form of oxygen. From an investigative standpoint, however, the case remains remarkably stable. Time has not introduced alternative suspects. New evidence has not surfaced. No competing theory has emerged that can account for the full shape of what happened inside that house. What remains is a pattern that still holds. A young man under financial pressure, a constructed identity on the verge of exposure, a father representing consequence, a mother representing protection, a weapon taken from within the home, an attack timed for sleep, an exit without verification. These are not fragments. They are components of a decision. The Porco case is often discussed as a circumstantial prosecution. That description is technically accurate, but emotionally misleading. Circumstantial evidence is not weak evidence. It is contextual evidence. It does not point with a finger. It surrounds. In this case, it surrounded completely. No piece alone condemns. Together, they converge. As an investigator, I am often asked a familiar question. Is it possible that Christopher Porco is innocent? In theory, almost anything is possible. The justice system operates on probability, not metaphysical certainty. But investigation is not about possibility. It is about plausibility, and plausibility has weight. For Christopher Porco to be innocent, an unknown intruder would have had to enter a quiet suburban home without force, locate a specific weapon, commit a targeted attack against two specific people, leave no trace, ignore valuables, spare one victim unintentionally, and disappear without motive or precedent. That theory exists only because it must, not because it fits. What makes this case endure is not mystery in the traditional sense. It is discomfort. Discomfort with the idea that someone can commit an act this violent without obvious rage. Discomfort with the idea that a mother's certainty can coexist with a court's condemnation. Discomfort with the possibility that the truth may be emotionally intolerable. This was not a crime of passion. It was a crime of preservation. And crimes of preservation are among the most dangerous because they do not feel evil to the person committing them. They feel necessary. That is what chills me about this case. Not the acts, not the blood, but the calm, the quiet planning, the lack of chaos, the ability to walk away and resume a normal routine. Those are the markers of a mind that has already crossed the line long before the act itself. Peter Porco never had a chance to defend himself. Jean Porco never had a chance to understand what was happening, and Christopher Porco, whether guilty or not, lost the future he was trying so desperately to protect. There are no winners here, only aftermath. When I review this case now, years later, I am struck by how ordinary it all looks from the outside. A family home, a college student financial stress, expectations, lies. Nothing about it announces tragedy. And that is the lesson this case leaves behind. Violence does not always arrive screaming. Sometimes it arrives disguised as normal life holding together just long enough to break. The Porco case will never offer emotional closure. It cannot. It asks us to accept that love can distort truth, that truth can exist without acceptance, and that justice does not heal every wound it identifies. As an investigator, my role is not to decide what people must believe. It is to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when the destination is uncomfortable. In this case, it led to a verdict that many still struggle to reconcile with a mother's faith. That tension is the legacy of the Porco case, a reminder that some crimes do not end with answers, but with questions that echo long after the files are closed. I am Miller Files, and this is one case that proves some silences are louder than confessions.